The jungle did not forgive mistakes. This was not a metaphor or a training instructor's motivational warning. It was a geological and biological fact, the kind of fact that the jungle demonstrated with complete indifference to the credentials or the intentions of whoever had made the error. The jungle at the eastern border of the operational zone had been killing people, soldiers and civilians and animals with equal dispassion, for longer than any institution that sent people into it had existed. It had its own logic, its own rules, its own particular version of justice that bore no resemblance to the kind written in military codes or international agreements. You either understood the jungle on its own terms, or the jungle introduced you to consequences that no amount of training had adequately prepared you for. Colonel Rashid Manzoor understood this, which was why he was standing at the edge of the command tent at 4:47 in the morning, looking out at the wall of darkness and vegetation that began 12 meters from where he stood, and feeling something that a man with 30 years of operational experience was not supposed to feel on the morning of a mission. He was feeling doubt. Not the ordinary doubt that preceded any complex operation, the productive uncertainty that sharpened planning and forced contingency thinking. This was something heavier and more specific. This was the doubt of a man who had sent 13 of his best shooters to attempt a shot that the mission required and had watched each one fail, and who was now standing in the dark trying to decide what to do with the option that remained, an option that he had resisted for reasons he was beginning to understand were not entirely professional. The target was a man named Darius Kell. Kell was not the kind of name that appeared in press releases or congressional briefings. He occupied the category of individuals whose existence was acknowledged only in the most classified corridors of the most sensitive institutions. A man who had spent 20 years building a network that sat at the intersection of weapons procurement, political manipulation, and the kind of violence that was designed to look like something other than what it was. He was responsible, by the most conservative estimates in the intelligence assessments Manzoor had read, for the deaths of between 200 and 300 people across 6 countries, deaths that had been attributed to everything from accidents to local political conflicts, to the kind of random violence that journalists cover when they have nothing more specific to say. He was careful. He was intelligent. He was surrounded by a security apparatus that had defeated every direct approach the relevant agencies had attempted over 11 years. And 3 days ago, a source whose reliability rating was as high as the service gave to any living person had provided information that placed Kell at a specific location, a compound built into the eastern jungle's interior, accessible only through terrain that made conventional assault essentially impossible, for a window of approximately 72 hours. The 72 hours had begun 61 hours ago. The shot was the only option. Everything else that had been considered and modeled and argued about in the planning sessions over the previous 3 days had produced conclusions that dead-ended on the same problem. Kell's compound was positioned in a way that made any approach detectable before it got close enough to matter. The security protocol would activate. Kell would be moved through one of 4 possible extraction routes that could not all be simultaneously covered with the resources available. He would disappear again into the network that had kept him invisible for 11 years. The shot required a precision marksman positioned on the ridge above the eastern approach, a natural elevation that provided a line of sight to the compound's main structure at a distance of just over 2,000 meters. 2,000 meters in standard conditions was at the outer limit of what an elite sniper could reliably achieve, but within the range of what the best of them had done in documented operational settings. The problem was that the eastern jungle at this time of year, in this specific terrain configuration, did not offer standard conditions in any meaningful sense of the phrase. It offered fog. Not the thin, decorative fog of temperate climates that burned off by mid-morning and was primarily aesthetic in its effect. It offered the dense, structural fog that formed in the hours before dawn when the temperature differential between the jungle canopy and the ground created a moisture column that moved and thickened and shifted in patterns that meteorological instruments could measure but not predict with operational precision. The fog at this hour was not a weather condition. It was a presence, something that occupied the jungle with the same organic authority as the trees and the animals, something that had its own behavior and its own logic, and its own complete indifference to what the people standing in it needed it to do. The first sniper had attempted the shot at midnight. His name was Sergeant First Class Yavar, and he had a confirmed kill record at distances exceeding 1,800 meters in 3 separate operational theaters. He had lain in position for 2 hours before attempting, using every instrument available to him to model the fog's movement and identify a window. The window had come and gone before his ballistic solution had resolved. He had fired anyway. The shot had missed by a margin that the spotters, using thermal imaging that the fog partially defeated, estimated at approximately 3 meters. The second had attempted at 12:40, the third at 1:15. Each had brought their own preparation, their own approach to the problem, their own version of the solution that the instruments and training and experience suggested was correct. Each had failed. The fog was not cooperating with any version of a solution that began with instruments, because the fog's behavior at this scale and in this specific terrain was producing variables that accumulated faster than any real-time analysis could resolve them. By 4 in the morning, 13 shooters had attempted. 13 had missed. The window was closing. 11 hours remained before Kell would be moved regardless of what happened, before the 72 hours expired and the source's information became history rather than intelligence. Manzor turned away from the dark jungle and walked back into the command tent. The people inside the tent looked at him with the particular expression of people who have run out of the obvious options and are waiting to see whether the person in command has access to options that are not obvious. He had one. He had resisted it for reasons he was now forced to examine honestly in the 4:47 darkness of a jungle morning, with 11 hours remaining. The reasons had presented themselves to him as professional considerations, as legitimate operational concerns about experience and track record in this specific environment and the particular demands of this particular shot. He had told himself that these were the reasons. He was now, with the honesty that extreme situations demand, acknowledging that they were not entirely the reasons. The other reason, the one beneath the professional language, was simpler and less defensible. She did not fit his mental image of the person who should be making this shot. Her name was Captain Zara Bassett. She was 33 years old. She had been attached to the unit for 4 months as part of a specialized integration program that the command had accepted with the kind of institutional reluctance that expressed itself in the small daily accumulation of assignments that were important enough to be official and unimportant enough to be safely given to someone whose capability the institution had not yet decided how to categorize. She had spent 4 months doing work that was below her level with a composure that Manzor had noticed and filed, and not acted on, because acting on it would have required him to examine assumptions that were easier left unexamined in the operational tempo of a unit with a full mission schedule. She had run logistics for 3 operations that she should have been leading. She had provided intelligence analysis that had materially shaped 2 mission plans, while receiving credit in the documentation that was technically accurate and operationally misleading about who had actually done the thinking. She had trained alongside the unit's shooters in the pre-dawn hours when training was optional, which meant when it was not being watched and evaluated by the people whose evaluation mattered, and she had trained with a quality of focus and a level of technical precision that Sergeant Major Farouk, who ran the unit's shooting program and was not given to enthusiasm about anything, had mentioned to Manzor in a conversation that Manzor had also filed and not acted on. She was awake when he went to find her. This did not surprise him. She was sitting outside the secondary tent in the dark, not with instruments or a notebook but simply sitting, her back against a supply case, her face turned toward the jungle. She was wearing her operational gear, and her rifle was beside her, assembled and ready, which told him that she had known this moment was coming even before he had admitted it to himself. He stood in front of her and said her name. She looked up at him without the expression of someone who has been waiting to be chosen. She had the expression of someone who has been ready for a long time and has made a kind of peace with the readiness that does not require the opportunity to validate it. He said that he needed to brief her on the target and the situation. He said this as if she did not already know everything about the target and the situation, because the briefing was what protocol required, and because protocol was one of the things that remained when everything else had been tried and found insufficient. She said that she was ready to hear the briefing. He sat down on the supply case beside her and told her everything: the target, the distance, the fog, the 13 attempts, the 11 hours. He told her without the framing that commanders sometimes use when they are asking someone to do something difficult, the framing that makes the request sound more manageable than it is because the person asking it cannot comfortably acknowledge how difficult it actually is. He told her the truth of the situation, which was that 13 of the best precision shooters he had access to had failed at this shot, and that she was the remaining option, and that he was asking her to attempt something that the morning had established was beyond the reach of the conventional approaches that everyone before her had used. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough that the jungle sounds filled the space between them, the insects and the distant water, and the particular breathing of a forest at the edge of its darkest hour. Then she asked him one question. She asked how long she had before she needed to be in position. He said 40 minutes. She stood, picked up her rifle, and said that she would need 30 of those 40 minutes before she was ready to move, and that she would spend them here, and that she would prefer to spend them without company. He said that he understood and started to leave. She said one more thing. She said that she needed him to understand something about how she was going to attempt this shot, because if he did not understand it and he was watching through the command instruments, what he saw would concern him, and she needed him to not intervene based on that concern. He turned back and said that she should explain. She said that she was not going to use the atmospheric instruments or the digital ballistic calculator or the spotting scope data in the conventional sense that the previous shooters had used them. She said that she had been in this jungle for 4 months, and that she had been doing something in those 4 months that was not in any report or evaluation, because it was not the kind of thing that appeared in reports or evaluations. She said that she had been learning the fog. He looked at her in the darkness, and she looked back at him with the complete steadiness of someone saying something that sounds unusual and knows it sounds unusual, and has no interest in softening it to make it more palatable, because softening it would make it less true. She said that the fog in this part of the jungle had a pattern that was not visible in any single observation or measurable by any single instrument, but that was present in the accumulated record of 4 months of daily observation, present not as data that could be processed into a calculation, but as something closer to a rhythm, a behavior that she had internalized to the point where she understood it the way she understood her own breathing. She said that this was not mysticism. She said that it was the same process by which any person who spends enough time in a specific environment begins to operate within that environment with a competence that looks like intuition, but is actually deep pattern recognition that has moved below the threshold of conscious thought. She said that she was going to attempt the shot from that place, from the internalized understanding of the fog's rhythm, at the moment that understanding indicated was the correct moment, and that the moment might not correspond to any window that the instruments identified, and that this was why she needed him not to intervene if what he saw did not look like what he expected a sniper's attempt to look like. Manzoor stood in the dark jungle with 30 years of operational experience, and the weight of 13 failed attempts in 11 hours, and the knowledge that Darius Kell was sleeping somewhere 2,000 meters away behind a wall of fog, and he made a decision. He said that he understood. He said that she had 30 minutes, and he walked back to the command tent without looking back, because looking back would have been an expression of the doubt he had decided, in the moment of walking away, to set aside. Inside the command tent, Sergeant Major Farouk was monitoring the instruments. He looked up when Manzoor entered and asked with his eyes the question that his mouth did not form. Manzoor said that Captain Bassett was going to attempt the shot. Farouk was quiet for a moment. Then he said that in 22 years he had seen 3 shooters with her quality of natural ability, and that all 3 had become the best operators he had worked with in their respective specialties. He said this in the flat, unsentimental way he said everything, which meant that it was more significant than it sounded. Manzoor said that he wished someone had told him this 4 months ago. Farouk said that he had mentioned it in October. Manzoor did not respond to this because there was nothing to say to it that was not an acknowledgement of something he did not want to formally acknowledge at 4:53 in the morning, with 11 hours remaining. Zara sat alone in the dark for 30 minutes. She was not reviewing ballistic tables or recalculating atmospheric data, or running the kind of analytical preparation that the previous shooters had used, because she had understood from the first failed attempt, which she had observed from a distance, that the analysis was the problem rather than the solution. The fog at this distance, and in this terrain, was producing what her own framework described as a complexity cascade, a situation where the variables multiplied each other rather than simply adding, where attempting to resolve them mathematically produced a solution that was accurate to the model and inaccurate to the reality, because the model could not contain all the variables that the reality presented. She had encountered this problem before, not with fog but with wind, in a training environment 3 years ago that had produced a period of extended failure followed by a fundamental reconsideration of her approach. The reconsideration had led her to a framework that her instructors had received with the particular skepticism that institutions reserve for frameworks that cannot be easily systematized, but that had produced results that the skeptics could not argue with and had eventually stopped trying to. The framework's essential principle was simple, and its application was not. The principle was that, at a certain level of environmental complexity, the shooter's analytical mind was not an asset but an interference, that the calculation introduced a lag between perception and action, that the environment's rate of change made fatal to precision, that the solution to a problem too complex for real-time analysis was not better analysis, but the elimination of analysis from the critical moment, not through ignorance of the variables, but through such deep familiarity with them that responding to them correctly required no conscious processing. This required a specific preparation that looked like nothing from outside. It looked like a person sitting quietly in the dark. It was in fact the final integration of 4 months of accumulated observation, the last pass through everything she had internalized about this specific jungle's specific fog, organizing it not into a calculation, but into something that felt, at its completion, like readiness. Not the readiness of having the right answer. The readiness of being in the right relationship with the question. At the 28th minute, something settled in her that she had learned to recognize over years of this kind of preparation, a quality of stillness that was different from the stillness preceding it, more complete, more quiet, like the moment when a tuning fork stops ringing, and you realize the sound had been present the whole time only because of its absence. She stood, picked up her rifle, and walked to the staging area where a guide was waiting to take her to the ridge position. The walk took 8 minutes through jungle that was absolutely dark except for the guide's shielded light, which he used sparingly, and which Zara did not need, because she had walked this path 11 times in the previous 4 months, not because she had been assigned to, but because she had known this moment was coming, and had prepared for it in the way she prepared for everything, completely and without announcing the preparation to anyone. The ridge position was a natural shelf in the rock face that jutted from the jungle canopy approximately 40 meters above the surrounding terrain, providing the line of sight to the compound that the geography of the mission required. The previous shooters had each occupied this position in turn, each bringing their instruments and their preparation and their version of the solution, each departing having added their attempt to the morning's record of failures. Zara settled into the position in the dark. The fog was present below her and in front of her, thick and moving in the way she knew it moved, its layers rotating at slightly different speeds due to the thermal differentials she had measured and catalogued, and eventually stopped measuring and cataloging, because the numbers had given her everything they were going to give, and the rest had to come from somewhere the numbers could not reach. She did not set up her atmospheric instruments. She placed her spotting data recorder to the side where it would capture whatever happened for the post-mission record, but where it was not in her primary field of attention. She established her position with the careful economy of someone who has done this in this specific location before, adjusting for the rock surface's angle and the rifle platform she had built into her preparation, because she had known the standard platform would introduce a vibration at this elevation that the instruments would not detect, but that her sensitivity to the rifle would. She looked through the scope. The fog moved in front of her in its complex layered way, sometimes thinner, sometimes thicker, its behavior the product of 1,000 variables interacting simultaneously in the dark air between the ridge and the compound. Through the scope, the compound's main structure was intermittently visible, appearing as a thermal signature through the fog-capable filter she was using, present for a second or two and then obscured, present again briefly, then gone. The pattern of visibility was not random. It had a rhythm that corresponded to the fog's layer rotation, and the rhythm was something she knew. She breathed in, she breathed out. She waited. In the command tent, Farouk was watching the thermal feed from the ridge camera that provided the command team's view of the shooter's position. Manzoor stood beside him, his arms folded, his face carrying the expression he had decided on, which was patience. The two men watched the feed in silence. On the feed, Zara was visible as a thermal outline in the shooting position. She was motionless. Her scope was directed at the target zone. The fog on the feed appeared as a fluctuating mass of thermal variation between her position and the compound. Minutes passed, 5 minutes, 8, 10. One of the other officers in the tent, a major named Ilyas who had been awake for 22 hours and whose patience had been eroded to something close to its final layer, said that she had been in position for 10 minutes without attempting. Manzoor said nothing. Ilyas said that the previous shooters had each attempted within 4 minutes of taking position, and that 10 minutes of waiting suggested either a problem or an approach that he did not understand. Manzoor said that it was the second of those two things, and that Ilyas should be quiet. Ilyas was quiet. On the ridge, Zara was not waiting in the way that the command tent interpreted waiting, as the absence of action. She was doing the most active thing she was capable of, which was listening to the fog with everything she had developed over 4 months of daily observation, feeling its rhythm through the scope's thermal image, the way a musician feels the rhythm of a piece through the vibration of their instrument before playing. The fog had a cycle, not a simple, measurable cycle that the instruments had been able to capture, because no instrument had been left in position long enough or positioned at enough simultaneous points to map the full three-dimensional behavior of the moisture column above the compound. But she had been in this jungle for 4 months, had observed the fog from the ridge and from the jungle floor and from the intermediate elevations, had developed an understanding of its behavior that was spatial and temporal, and could not be adequately represented in any data format but was present in her. The way the shape of a place you have lived in for years is present in your body even in complete darkness. The cycle had a period of approximately 14 minutes between the moments when the fog's layered rotation produced maximum alignment, the brief convergence of the thermal columns that created a window of reduced density along the specific vector between her position and the compound's main structure. The window was not a clearing. It was a thinning, a brief reduction in the fog's interference that lasted between 3 and 7 seconds depending on the night's specific thermal conditions. She had been in position for 12 minutes. She felt the cycle beginning to move toward convergence, felt it not as a thought or a calculation, but as a physical awareness, the same quality of knowing that experienced sailors describe when they sense a change in the sea before the instruments register it. Her breathing changed, slowing to the final rhythm of the shooting preparation. Her right index finger rested against the trigger with the specific pressure that was not quite touching, and not quite not touching, the pressure of complete readiness that was also complete stillness. The fog shifted. It was not visible as a dramatic clearing. Through the scope's thermal filter, it appeared as a marginal change in the density of the interference pattern, a slight opening in the thermal mass that was simultaneously present and already beginning to close. The window was approximately 4 seconds. She fired at second 2. The sound of the shot broke the ridge's silence and echoed down into the jungle below, and returned as a series of diminishing repetitions that the jungle absorbed back into itself within moments. The bullet traveled its 2,000 meters through the fog in a flight time of approximately 2.3 seconds. In those 2.3 seconds, the thermal window was still open, not by much, not with any margin that an instrument could have predicted or any calculation could have guaranteed, but open. The compound's main structure registered the impact on the thermal feed 7 seconds after the shot. In the command tent, the confirmation came through the spotter's instrument 40 seconds after that, because the thermal imaging required recalibration after the impact to produce a readable result. The spotter's voice on the radio was the voice of someone who had been awake for 22 hours and who had watched 13 shooters fail, and who was now reading an instrument result that required him to say a word that he had not expected to say this morning. He said, "Confirmed." Manzor did not move for a moment. Then he closed his eyes very briefly, which was the most visible expression of anything he allowed himself in operational settings, and then he opened them and said the words that moved the mission into its next phase. In the command tent, no one spoke for a moment. Then Farouk said, in his flat and completely unsentimental way, that he had mentioned her in October. On the ridge, Zara cleared her weapon, secured it, and sat back against the rock face for a moment. The fog continued its rotation below her, indifferent to what had just happened within it, continuing the cycle she had spent 4 months learning. The eastern sky was beginning to show the earliest suggestion of light, not yet visible as color, but present as a slight reduction in the density of the darkness. She allowed herself exactly 1 minute of stillness in which she let herself feel what she felt, which was not triumph, because she had learned that triumph was a complicated response to a complicated act, but something quieter and more specific. The satisfaction of a person who has spent a long time being ready for something and has finally been asked to do it, and has done it to the level that their preparation deserved. This was not a small thing. It was also not the only thing, and she understood the difference. Then she stood, picked up her rifle, and began the 8-minute walk back through the jungle to the staging area. Manzor met her at the edge of the camp. He was alone, which she noted, because Manzor was rarely alone in operational contexts. He had come to meet her himself rather than sending someone, and this was a choice that communicated something he apparently needed to communicate in person rather than through the efficient delegation that characterized his command style. He said her name and then stopped, which was unusual for a man who had been speaking in complete and precise sentences for 30 years as a professional necessity. She waited. He said that he owed her a conversation that was overdue, and that this was not the right moment for it in its full form, but that he wanted to begin it now and continue it properly when the mission's immediate requirements had been addressed. He said that the 4 months of her attachment to the unit had not reflected her capability, and that the assignments she had been given had not reflected her qualification, and that the reasons for this, when he examined them honestly, were not the professional reasons he had told himself they were. She looked at him in the early dark with the same steady expression she had worn when he came to find her before the shot. He said that he intended to correct the record in the formal documentation of her attachment and to recommend her for the operational role that her qualification warranted. He said that this was not compensation for the shot she had just made. He said that it was an overdue correction that the shot had made impossible for him to continue deferring. She said that she appreciated him saying so. He said that appreciation was not what he was looking for, and he said it with the directness of a man who had spent 30 years in situations where honesty was operationally necessary and had learned to apply that standard to himself as well. She said that she understood what he was looking for and that she would say this. The correction mattered not only for her but for the unit, because a unit whose most capable people were in the wrong roles was a unit operating below its potential, and a unit operating below its potential was a unit that would eventually face a situation where that gap between potential and performance produced consequences that no one could correct after the fact. He said that this was precisely right, and that it was also something that a commanding officer should have understood before being told. She said that understanding things before being told required examining assumptions before they became operational liabilities, and that this was hard work, and that most people did not do it until the assumptions had already become liabilities. He said that he had just had a very expensive lesson in the cost of that particular failure. She said that the lesson's value depended on what was done with it. He said yes, and then he said that the mission's secondary phase required his attention and that the full conversation would happen this afternoon and that he was glad she had been here. She said that she was glad to have had the opportunity. He walked back toward the command tent. She stood at the edge of the camp for a moment longer, looking at the jungle that was beginning, in the slowly arriving light, to show the first details of its actual shape after the long hours of darkness had made it a single, undifferentiated mass of sound and shadow. The fog was still present but thinning now as the light arrived, burning off from the top down in the way it did every morning when the sun reached the canopy's thermal layer, and the differential that had produced the fog began to collapse. By 8 in the morning it would be gone, and the jungle would be sharp and clear, and completely unlike the thing it had been at 5 in the morning, when the fog had been its truest self, and she had learned to speak its language. She had spent 4 months being underestimated. She had spent those same 4 months preparing for the moment that being underestimated would end, not because she needed that moment to know her own capability, but because capability without application was a private satisfaction, and she was not, at her core, interested in private satisfactions. She was interested in the work, in the mission, in the thing that the shot had been in service of, which was larger than the shot itself, and larger than the morning, and larger than any individual demonstration of what she was capable of. She walked back to the secondary tent and sat down and drank water from the bottle she had left there before the night's work began. In 6 hours, there would be a debriefing. In that debriefing, her methodology would be questioned and examined and documented in the way that all methodologies were questioned and examined and documented, with the institutional rigor that was the service's necessary response to anything that did not fit the existing framework. She would explain her approach, and the explanation would be received with a mixture of technical interest and institutional skepticism that she had learned to navigate without losing either the approach or her patience. She would provide the documentation that the framework required. She would answer every question with the precision and completeness that her integrity demanded. And then she would submit the proposal she had been writing for 3 months, the proposal for a training program that would develop the specific kind of environmental intelligence she had used that morning, the program that she had designed not for herself, because she did not need it, but for the shooters who would come after her, the ones who would face situations like this morning's, and who needed a framework that the current training doctrine did not provide. The proposal would be reviewed. It would be questioned. It would be sent back for revisions and then reviewed again, and then questioned again, in the way that proposals for new approaches were always processed, with the careful slowness of institutions that had learned, through decades of operational experience, that new approaches sometimes worked and sometimes failed catastrophically, and that the difference between those outcomes was usually in the quality of the foundation. She had built a very good foundation. She was patient about the time it would take for the institution to examine it properly. She was patient about most things, except the work itself, about which she was not patient at all, about which she was completely and permanently urgent in the way of a person who understands that the work matters and that mattering is the best reason to do something as well as it can possibly be done. The jungle outside was brightening. The fog was retreating up the thermal gradient toward the canopy, uncovering the ground-level world that it had concealed all night, the roots and the water and the particular quality of jungle morning light that came through the canopy in shafts and made the whole thing look, briefly, like something sacred. Sergeant Major Farouk appeared at the tent entrance and said that the colonel wanted her in the command tent for the preliminary debrief in 30 minutes. She said that she would be there. He started to leave and then stopped. He turned back and said, in the same flat, unsentimental way he said everything, that he had seen 3 shooters in 22 years with her quality of natural ability and her quality of developed method, and that all 3 had shaped the program they worked in permanently, meaning that the program was different because they had been in it and would remain different after they were gone. He said this without elaboration, and without the additional framing that most people added to statements of this kind, when they wanted to ensure the weight of what they were saying was properly registered. She said that she understood what he was saying, and that she was grateful. He nodded once and left. She sat for another moment in the tent entrance, looking at the brightening jungle, listening to it begin its morning translation from the creature of dark and fog that it had been all night into the creature of light and sharp detail that it would be by midday. She had learned both versions of it and the versions in between, had spent 4 months sitting with it in every condition and every hour, building the relationship that the morning had required. The fog was almost gone now. What remained of it drifted in thin wisps between the trees, the last remnants of the night's geometry dissolving into the arriving day. She had learned its language in the dark. She had spoken it once clearly at the moment that mattered. She stood and walked toward the command tent, where the work of explaining what she had done would begin, knowing that the explanation would be less complete than the doing of it, but that the doing of it was already documented in a result that no instrument in the command tent had predicted, and that no calculation the previous 13 shooters had run had produced. 2,000 meters through fog, 1 shot. The jungle had not forgiven the fog for making itself available to her understanding. The jungle did not forgive or not forgive. It simply presented its conditions to whoever came to operate within it, the same conditions to everyone, without preference or prejudice. She had simply been the one who had taken the time to listen.